When I was younger, I lived on an estate of houses that backed into a huge field where many people walked their dogs. It was even used as a cut-through to get to the next neighborhood, which would take approximately 25 minutes to walk through. When I was about 13, my neighbor and I decided to camp out for the night in my back garden, which apart from a 6-foot wooden fence was completely open to the field, albeit with 20 trees around the fence. Seeing as we were into action figures at the time, we decided that we would make the tent a hideout. So we got together some branches and one of those army nets to put over the tent to make it a bit more stealthier. We also put the tent in the corner of the garden, which had a small roof over it, which made it very dark once the sun went down. We did the usual thing, ate loads of sweets before we decided to try to get some sleep in our well-hidden super dark tent. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone landing and then walking on small stones. I realized that below the fence, my mom and dad had decorated with some gravel and flower pots. At first, I thought it was our cat, but it was far too loud to be such a small animal. I slowly sat up, trying not to make too much noise from my sleeping bag. Then I heard it again. I once again tried to make my way to the front of the tent silently and looked through the zipper. About 10 feet away from us, there were 2 guys in all black, crouching under the windowsill of the kitchen, talking to each other. I immediately froze, and I had no idea what to do. They proceeded to creep closer to us, looking for more windows or maybe an entrance. We were in the corner of the garden, so we were quite close to the path that led down the side of our house, where there was a door into the adjoining garage. I heard them talking quite clearly as now they were less than 5 feet away from me and my friend, who was still asleep. They were talking about being unseen and just taking whatever they could find in the garage instead of breaking into the house and disturbing anyone. I had no idea what to do, so I rang the house phone, which was pretty loud, and waited for someone to answer. It took a while because it was pretty early. As soon as the phone rang, the 2 people bolted to the fence and hopped over. My dad then answered, and I whispered for him to get outside ASAP with a bat or something. Nothing happened in the end, but I'm glad that my friend slept silently. I worked summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor Mike take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, make s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30ish, I tell the kids that it's time for bed. They head into their tents, which are positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in the line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and me and Mike are still up shooting the shit by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decide to head into our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day, and remains my go-to campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us and slightly above the water. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes, before it came close enough to us to where we could see that it was mounted on front of a kayak and someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it's important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes to how to deal with strange encounters in an environment where we are responsible for groups of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we're camping with a group from a recognized organization and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew closer. Paddling in this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized that she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly shitting myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine and that she had to leave. "That's good, just as I suspected for this time," she said with a smile. Then she turned her kayak around and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out. Not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts of the safety of the kids that we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know that I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie. And I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had zipped open the door to their tent and saw a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline. I'm a female and I was 19 years old at the time. I love camping. Anytime my friends and I would come home from college, we would load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day, the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car that I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded, yet within safe distance to civilization that I could go run and get help if needed. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a plus for me. It's the same reason that people listen to these stories. It's fun to be scared. So I make a little camp and get a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, reading a book and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling that I was being watched, and I stopped, dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right, then I see a doe bolt 100 feet or so in front of me. I laugh at myself and went back to the camp with an armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside the ring of light casted by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I just shrug it off. Around 1 a.m., I decided to go into my tent and bring out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and kept smoking cheap cigars. Another reason I like camping. I get to act however I want, so I passed out relatively quick. Around 2 o'clock, I start hearing footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or another animal, more likely a raccoon because I had probably left some food out. I'm still on my guard though. After about 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't shit my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed, with my kabar in hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric, but I was holding it out in the hopes that it was some of my buddies from a frat playing a joke on me. And then suddenly, as it begun, it stopped. I started feeling slightly more secure because daylight would be coming out in about 2 or 3 hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going back to sleep. All of a sudden at 4 o'clock, I realized that I should put on my boots just in case anything did happen. I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert for a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes blaring. I freak the fuck out and run out of the tent. I got about 2 steps before someone grabs me around the mouth. I open my mouth to scream, but instead, the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge rushes of adrenaline. In my case, I just clamped down. There's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, but his finger popped off. He screamed and pulled his hand away with the missing digit, falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill that I was camping on, and I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to. A little sorority girl in a wife beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots. I also had some blood that oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my lip as well. I told them what happened. They called the police, got me some real clothing, and the man at the house made me a whiskey and coke. The cops went to check it out, and when they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw made me even more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire earlier. The finger was also gone, suggesting that he had come back. The kicker is they never caught the guy. So somewhere out there, there's a man sitting down to dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky.